Good day, Professor Breaker here with New Mexico State University. In this video we're going to be going over and adding some supplemental material to Chapter 1 for the Python Crash Course book that we're using. This is for the course ICT 362 Software Tech 2. So in the chapter pretty much goes over Python versions, Python on different operating systems like the Windows, Mac, and Linux. It talks about how to install them on each one of them. It talks about running a simple Python program, running Python from a terminal, and using the code editor Sublime. In this video, we're going to talk about some supplemental material. I'm going to expand on Python versions, and I'm going to talk about version 2.7 or version 2 versus version 3. And we're going to talk about the default version. And then we're going to talk about code editors. So let's go ahead and talk about Python's version 2 versus version 3. So Python version 2 versus version 3 would be something like Windows XP versus Windows 10. There's a big difference in the coding base for the two operating systems, and very big difference in the way that they run. However, there's sometimes you can run Python 2 code on Python 3, and sometimes you can run Python 3 code on Python 2. It really depends on what libraries were used and what formatting were used, syntax was used. So for instance, let me give you an instance of this. We're going to look at our virtual machine here. This is a Linux CentOS virtual machine, and if I type on here Python -- version, you can see that the default version of Python is 2.7.5. Now, I can also do Python 2 -- version, and I should get the same thing. But I can also do a Python 3 version, and this tells me I also have Python 3.6.8 installed on this operating system. So obviously you can have multiple versions of Python installed on a computer. Well, that's a little bit confusing, but let's go take a look at this. Now I can use the which command, and this will tell me when I type Python and get some response up here. So when I typed up here and said Python version, it'll tell me which file it actually called. And so this tells me it used the bin/python. I'm going to look at the Python and just take a view here. And we're going to look at everything that says Python, all the files that say Python. And this is an interesting view, because if you look, it'll show you that Python, the word Python, is actually a link pointing to Python 2. And Python 2 is a link pointing to Python 2.7. And there's the actual executable. And you can see the size here of the files here. There's the actual executable Python 2.7. Same thing with Python 3 is simply a link pointing to the version Python 3.6. So we could install a newer version of Python on this operating system also, Python 3.9, and all we would have to do is change the link to point to the Python 3.9. We could have Python 3.6 and Python 3.9 installed on this operating system. Okay? So why don't we just upgrade our default Python to Python 3? And we could do that. We can just remove Python. Oops, we have to sudo this. And now if I just do Python, you can see it doesn't work. It doesn't find Python. And we're going to create a new link. So create a new link saying Python, and we'll just point it to Python 3. Again, we have to do the sudo. Now if I do Python, I have just changed my default Python to 3.6.8. This is awesome. It's a very simple way. It's a very simple thing to do to fix or to change your default Python. However, I'm going to throw a bit of caution out here, because all of a sudden everything that relies on that default version of Python is going to be using Python 3. In CentOS 7, that can create a problem. For instance, let's do a simple sudo yum update. Oh, we're getting errors. Sudo yum install mlocate. I've just broke my yum installer, my Yellow Dog Update Manager. I just broke my yum installer. So apparently, switching the default version of Python in CentOS 7 is probably not a good idea, because there's code written for yum that's written in version 2 that will not run on version 3. By switching our default version, it's trying to use 3 and coming up with errors. So let's go ahead and fix that again. And then we can again do the, now we're pointing back at 2.7. Let's try that yum update again. Now it's working, and it's going to take a while, but there we go. So some points of caution. We can, let's just do no for now. We can look at yum, we can look at Python here and look at the default version, simply doing the Python -- version. If no default version is set, we can set a default version, because if no default version is set, there's nothing relying on the default version. And most new code is written referring to Python 2 or Python 3, or hopefully I expect soon Python 4. We're running up to 3.9, so I'm assuming a 4 will be coming out at some point. Okay, so a little bit about Python versions in Linux. So let's take a look at Windows now. If we look at here, I'm running Python version 3.9.2. Now if I go and look at my, let's go back to my C drive, I actually install Python on my C drive, and you can see here I have Python 3.7 and Python 3.9 installed on my C drive. Again, I can have multiple versions. I used to have Python 2 installed on my previous computer, along with Python, 2 different versions of Python 3. So you can install multiple versions on your Windows computer. When you go to install them with the installer, you want to tell it where you want to install it, and by default it's going to want to go into the program files. I like it right on the C drive. Now if we look inside of those folders, you'll notice that there is a python.exe executable. So in each one of these folders has their own Python executable, and again they're named Python. So when we type in here Python -- version, how does it know to go to 3.9? Okay, how does Windows know to use the 3.9 version of Python? And it's really simple. It has to do with the path variable, because what you can do in Windows is if you include a path in the path variable, it will look for the executable based on that path. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because I didn't put python.exe. So what it'll look for, python.exe, python.cmd, python.bat, any file that the Windows system determines is an executable. It'll look for a file with one of those extensions in the files in the path. Let's look at the path. Okay, so this is all of the path, and they're separated with semicolons. So you can see there's a semicolon right there. So the first path is obviously the, actually it's not the, usually it's Windows System 32. Usually I'm looking at Windows System 32 right here. That's the most common path. So everything in the System 32 folder will run. In the program files, x86, Autodesk, and you can look down here and see Python 39. scripts and just Python 39. Right there's Python 39. Okay, there's some other ones here that are in the Python 39 folder, and we're going to be talking about this idle library, but Python 39. So because Python 39 is in the path variable in Windows, it's going to run the Python 39 version. Now if I wanted to switch to Python 37 or 3.7 as my default variable, or if I install a newer Python and want to make that my default, basically I want to remove this Python 39 and put the new one in the path variable. And oftentimes on the install of Python, it'll do that for you. Okay? So just how they choose the default version of Python that it's going to be running. Okay, in this case, that was the Linux one. In here, it's based on the path variable that's in Windows. In the Linux, it's going to be based on the shortcut, which file the shortcut is pointing to. Let's do LL. And again, the shortcut Python is pointing to Python 2. So I can use Python 2, I can use Python 3, I can use Python. Either one of those will run Python, but Python and Python 2 will run actually Python 2.7. Python 3, in this case, will run Python 3.6. All right, that was the first topic I want to talk about. The next one we're going to go into is different code editors. All right. We're going to leave this available but not up. So let's look at the Sublime code editor. In the book, Python Crash Course, it talks about code editors. And here's Sublime. Sublime is very easy, simple to use. And the nice thing is you can open a file or open a folder. So if I open a folder, I can choose my folder that I want to open, and I typically have a folder called PyCode where I keep a lot of my code, or else sometimes in my individual projects I'll have project folders here. Let's grab let's actually just open, we're just going to open the PyCode folder here and select that, and it's going to give me a list of everything in the folder, and so I can go browsing the folder. Oops, I opened chapter 3. Okay, so in here there's a demo py, so I can look at the files in that folder. Now if I want to, I can file close the folder, close all files. I have to close the file first, and then I can choose the folder and say file close folder. Somewhere's here. Close to window, close file, close all files. Well, there's supposed to be a way you can close the folder. I'm missing something here, but this is Sublime. Now when you do open up a file and you're looking at it, you can actually just run it under project tools. There we go, build. So when we run a build, it's going to run the information down below here. So I'm going to give it 4 dice, and it seems to be failing right here. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. It should be continuing on with the program. Apparently it stopped it. I'm not sure why. Maybe it doesn't like the input-output. But that's Sublime. Again, according to the book, you can download it and run it unregistered as long as you want. Now let's look at the next one. The next one I have on here is using the idle code editor. And idle is really interesting. When you installed Python, let's go back to the Python here. So we installed Python 3.9. When you installed Python 3.9, you actually installed the idle code editor too. So if you look here, there's Python 3.9, go into the library and go into the idle library, and at the very bottom of that you'll see a batch file called idle.bat, and if you run that, it actually opens up an idle shell. And this is a shell very similar to a command prompt where we just type Python. And here again we have the interactive shell, and this is talked about in the book, the interactive shell. Python will open up an interactive shell using the software named idle. And in here we can do basically print and it'll run it for us. Same thing as on the command prompt. Other things you can do right from the interactive shell, you can do math. So instead of opening up a calculator, you can do 5 times 6, and it'll give you the answer for that. You can do complex math, 5 plus 7 times 3 to the power of 2, to the power of 2. And we'll do this is called integer division, dividing that by 3. Let's go 5. There we go. So we can do complex math, and I'm assuming that's correct. But right from the interactive shell, we can do code. We can even do for loops. So for I in range. And let's go 2, 9. Okay, and so it allowed us to run a for statement. Again, I had to indent it for the second line. We have to have our format correctly, but allow us to do simple for loops. We can do all of the code that we want to do in the interactive shell. The downside of doing it in an interactive shell is we lose it. However, idle also has a editor, so we can actually say open, and we're going to open a file, and let's go back into our Py code here, and we'll just grab a simple one here. We can do the let's do the dice.py. That's a fun one. Open that one. I think that's the one we were using with the other one. This is a little bit different. Okay, so from here I can edit my code, and you can see it's color coded, which is nice. And then I can run it and say run the module, and it's going to open up my interactive shell, and it's going to ask me how many dice. Let's say I want 6 dice, and let's say that I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons or something that needs a 28-sided dice. Now I have 6 dice rolls. Okay, so I'm rolling 6 dice with 28 sides, and there's my random numbers coming from the dice. All right, so there's our idle. Here's our code editor right here. We have code editor shell, and we have a running shell. Basically, it's going to display the output of our code. Now, if we created a Python code that created a form or something, some GUI interface, then it would show that. So this is idle. This gets installed right with Python. So if we look at let's go back to the idle library here. Look at the batch file. The batch file, again, I said that in Windows it'll look for a executable or batch file or a CMD file to run it. Well, this is a batch file, so it'll just run it. So if we, same as double clicking an executable. If we look at the actual code in it, you can see here it's basically looking at the current directory. It's going up 2 directories. So from the current directory, which is the idle library, it's going up 2 directories, and it's running python w.exe. And then out of the current directory, it's running the idle.py. The W gets discounted, but it's running idle.py. So if we look back at that directory structure, you'll see there's an idle.py, and it's being run using idle python w.exe. And so if we go up 2, so that's what that // it means go up 2, and in here you'll see that there's a python w executable. So that's what the batch file is doing. It's calling the Python executable. It's passing the idle.py, and we could even go look at that's the nice thing about Python is because it is basically all script based, you can look at this and you can go say, hey, let's look at this idle.py and see what the code is in there. So we can open that and look at that code, and here's the code in there. And this one's basically checking directories, looking for idlelib, and it's going to start up the main in the from idlelib.py shell. It's looking for a py shell file, and it starts the main. And so we can go back again and we can look at the py shell, And there's our Py shell. We can look at our code in there. If we click it, let's click Edit with Notepad++ again. And there's all our code in Py shell. And you can see that this is using Notepad++, which is the next one. So we've talked about Sublime, we've talked about idle, and this is Notepad++, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But there's our code, and it's nicely color coded for us. But there's all the code. And you can go back and look at how that program is written. And so basically you could reverse engineer this if you want to modify it. You could take all of this code and figure it all out and reverse engineer it. The one thing that is very clear about this code is the comments are kind of limited. Normally when you have this def, this is a function, you want to tell what the function does. And so whoever wrote this did not comment it very well. There's a little bit, but not much. So there you go. But there's your code. There's existing code that runs this this idle interactive code editor. That is included when you install Python. So let's move to the next one. And on our list here, we've talked about Sublime, we've talked about idle. Let's talk about Notepad++. And again, Notepad++ is a good code editor. Again, with Notepad++, it color codes as soon as you put a dot, save as a .py. So if I say a new file and I start entering code, and because I'm going to comment, because it doesn't know what language you're programming this in, it's not going to color code it very well. But as soon as you save it as, let's go ahead and save it in PyCode. We'll say just sample.txt, or we want sample.py. And of course we want to change this to all files, all types. So it saves it as a py. Now all of a sudden it color codes it. So again, as soon as you add the extension, save it so that the program IDE, integrated development or code editor, knows what kind of code it is. It'll use its own internal code to color code it for us. We can also run it. Notepad++ has a run function, and in the run function you can enter basically what you want to run. And this is, you can do a Google search on this. There's multiple different ones. You can run it where it opens up a command shell and runs in the same command shell all the time, or in this case it's going to open up a new one. But I basically have it Python, because we have a default Python set in this Windows version, -i for interactive, and then we pass it the variable, the full current path. And then when we run this, it will run out and it'll open up a command prompt and run the code. Now if I open up a new one and say, okay, let's run this one. Now you can run this, and once you have one that works, you can save it. And so that's what I did here. I clicked on run, and I have a Python one, so I can run it this way. And so this one here, this code says enter the name and year that you were born. And I was born in 1997. Okay, Bob, you're 23 years old. You were born in next year. You'll be 24. The last line has 62 characters. So it's just some simple playing around with code that you can do. So it runs it, and every time it runs it, it opens up a new command prompt. So you can see that this is the command prompt we had. So it opens up a command prompt every time it runs it, and then you can just close the command prompt. So there's how we can get our interactiveness. We can run our code, we can edit our code, it color codes it, it runs it. So Notepad++ is good. It's a good editor. I've used it quite a bit. And it is built in. You can, like I said, you can right click on files and say open with code editor. If you've installed code editor and added that to it, you can right click and basically open any file with Notepad++. You can open it with brackets. You can open it with other code editors if you want to. But Notepad++ is pretty easy, pretty simple, pretty lightweight. Okay, so the last one we're going to talk about is VS Code Editor. So let's go ahead and run the VS Code Editor. Oops, that's not it. VS Code Editor is a Microsoft product, Visual Studio Code. It's very much like Sublime in that you can open a folder, And so again, we can open the folder, or we can clone a repository. And cloning a repository gives us the ability to like go out and pull a Git repository. And then the nice thing about it is it integrates with Git, so you can run Git commands on it to download a repository, create a branch, do your code editing, merge your branch, and submit it back up to the internet or wherever your repository is stored at, whether it's a local or a remote repository. In this case, let's go ahead and open a folder. And we'll just go File, Open Folder, and let's go open that PyCode folder that I have a bunch of random code in. And we're just going to select that file. Let's open that up. Let's open up Chapter 5. This is from a different class that I taught, so this is not regards to Python Crash Course. But here's a bunch of stuff. I can say, okay, let's go ahead and do a file. Let's count autos by make. There we go. So we've got that code. Now, when we go to run it, it says, hey, but there's some extension for VS Studio or VS Code, and it has extensions. Let's go ahead and include the Python extension. And then the very path seems to have some paths containing the empty character. We're just going to ignore that. But there's our code. It's color coding it again. Here I'm just creating a simple array, and actually I'm creating a dictionary. This is different than an array. This is a dictionary, and I'm printing out the dictionary, and then doing some other things. So I can run it right here, and I can run it with debugging and without debugging. Debugging is going to give me some extra information about the code, or I can run it without debugging. And there we go, it's running it here. And so it's kind of creating a, apparently for this, it's creating kind of a graph. So there's obviously more rabbits than squirrels, more dogs than squirrels, more cats than aardvarks. So we can, using basically a bar graph is what this creates for us based on the number associated with the dictionary. So again, simple Virtual Studio Code, does a nice job, has some really good tools. It's probably a little bit more advanced than Sublime, and it's supported by Microsoft. So let's go through them really quick. We notice the similarities between them. They all have a code editors. They all have a code input window that color codes them. All of them do. So they're all color coded. Sublime has the ability to open up folders, just very much like Visual Studio Code. Sublime, you can open up folders or individual files, and they're listed here. You have a little Explorer pane here, and then your code, and you have an output pane at the bottom. Sublime was the same way. You basically had an output pane, although the runnings of this failed. I'm not sure why. Basically it worked in the other one when we used idle. So these two are similar this way in that they have, again, Explorer windows or panes and folder panes, a navigation pane, and then it has the files. Idle is really simple. It comes with Python. It's installed with Python. It has a run function. When it runs, it basically opens up a separate Python editor or Python shell and runs the code in the Python shell, and it runs fine. So there's your Python. That's very simple. Python code editor written in Python. You can go look at the code for Python for idle. And then last but not least, there is Notepad++, which again will do color coding, allows you to run once you put in the correct string, and you can use this for any different types of programming. That's a nice thing about, again, VS Code, Sublime, and you can use these for different things more than Python, but then you can run it and it'll basically open up a command window with the output of your code. So all of these have the ability to color code, display the code, edit your code, and then run and basically run and test your code. Sublime and VS Code have Explorer windows or navigation windows, and Sublime we have debugging here. We can write with debugging, which means we can put stop points and things like that. So we can put a stop point in there. So it runs up to here and stops. And so that's what running with debugging. Start debugging will get to that point. And I have not used this enough no, the active Python file. So it gets to that point. Now it's stopped, and you can click go on that. Probably continue. There we go. So now it's finished the code. So debugging is available. It's kind of like NetBeans was similar to this. So hope that's helped. I'm just rambling here, so I'll stop. Hopefully that's helped you a little bit understand default versions of Python. Gives you a little bit of heads up that you can use more than one code editor. Sublime is good. VS Code may be better. But there's also idle and Notepad++. And if you've done a lot of programming before for this class, I don't care which code editor you work with, so long as you understand the code. One thing I do want to touch on quick with Notepad++. Just a heads up, in Python, the indentation is really, really critical. And if you put a tab in there, use a tab, that will break your Python code. However, you can go into the preferences here. Let's see, settings, preferences, and go to language, and you can change that and you set the tab size. I like it at 2 myself. I don't like that 4-space tab. I like a 2-space tab, and then you can replace the tabs with spaces. Make sure you check this box. It's one thing that's very important if you do use Notepad++. It'll make your Python and YAML programming so much easier. Again, YAML's not for this class, it's for a future class, but if you're using Notepad++ and like it, make sure you make these changes to it. All right, have a great day and have a great start to this semester.